Okay. Hello, everyone. Happy Pi Day for those of you who are mathematically inclined. Welcome to today's webinar where we're going to talk about automating IT processes in a code-filled world, why scripting is not real automation. If you're participating in this webinar, I'm going to assume that you do scripting with one or more of the major scripting tools out there, like PowerShell, command line executions, VBScript, etc. These tools are pretty powerful and let you accomplish a lot of things. However, scripting does not equal automation, and today we're going to explain why. My name is Guy Nadivi. I am the Senior Director of Business Development for IAHU, and I'm joined today by my colleague Peter Lee, IAHU's Director of Professional Services. Together, we're going to provide you with a brief PowerPoint presentation followed by a live demo that I think you'll find very interesting, especially if you do a lot of scripting. Let me also just say up front that if you have any questions during the webinar, please submit them through your chat client on the GoToMeeting panel, and we'll try answering all of them during the Q&A portion of today's webinar right after the demo. Before we begin, I'm going to do a brief commercial about our company, IAHU, and then we'll get right to the content. We were founded in 2007, the old-fashioned way, as a bootstrapped startup by our two founders, Gabby and Yaron, who are still with us as CEO and CTO, respectively. We have one product, and it's called iShare, which first became available 8 years ago and is currently in release 4.8.2. We are very proud that last year Gartner named us their cool vendor in IT automation for 2016. That's kind of like being named Miss America if there were a beauty pageant for data center products. And we have over 150 customers, most of them very large, very well-known organizations. We are funded by Silicon Valley VC money, and our main investor is a firm called BGV that's led by Eric Benamou. Some of you may recognize that name from when he was CEO of 3Com Networks and chairman of Palm Computers. He's currently chairman of our board. Our company has offices in Tel Aviv, Israel, where we conduct R&D, and we run professional services out of our office in Midtown Manhattan. And we also have an office now in the Bay Area. And finally, we're coming off of consecutive record-breaking years, so we're growing rapidly. And on that note, I encourage you to check out the careers page on our website if you're looking for a new opportunity with a great firm. Okay, let's start today's webinar by defining what constitutes automation, especially since some of you might be under the impression that scripting is automation, and we, however, believe otherwise, and of course, we'll be demonstrating why. There's just a few key features we believe differentiate automation from scripting, but they tend to make a huge difference in your results. First off, an automation tool needs lots of pre-built content right out of the box. It can be used exactly like Lego building blocks to quickly assemble the tasks you want to automate into a workflow. By the way, you'll be seeing a live workflow as part of today's webinar in case you're wondering what is a workflow. An automation solution also needs lots of connections and integrations to other tools, systems, and devices so that cross-platform automation can be orchestrated from a single pane of glass. Furthermore, the automation solution should be so easy to use, even a junior sysadmin with zero programming expertise can master the system in less than a day. And very, very importantly, an automation tool should not require any scripting or programming or coding of any kind whatsoever. And why do these particular features define automation? Well, because one of the promises of true automation is that you don't have to rely on specialized talent to orchestrate activities in your environment. Therefore, in order to reach that level of maturity, these are the critical features an IT organization must look for in any automation tool it brings into its data center, NOC, or SOC. Let's begin talking now about how scripting differs from automation for those of you still thinking that scripting might actually be automation. For starters, it's important to understand the significant difference between the two when it comes to the expertise level needed. In scripting, you have to be pretty knowledgeable about the scripting language and its programming requirements in order to be productive. Some even feel that you have to be the equivalent of a martial arts black belt in order to truly be productive with scripting. But that's not the case with automation, which doesn't require you to do any scripting or have any programming knowledge at all. You can be the equivalent of a martial arts beginner with automation, in other words, a white belt, and still be very productive. Manageability is another big differentiator between scripting and automation. In general, scripts are distributed throughout IT, primarily because different servers need particular scripts to run at different times and require them to be stored locally. That can be a change management nightmare. With automation, however, all workflows are stored centrally in one location, making it very easy to implement change management, as well as making it much easier to schedule jobs from a single pane of glass rather than having numerous cron jobs on each server. Reusability is a very important productivity issue. Various dictionaries define reusability in a computer science context as the use of existing assets in some form within the software product development process. And by the way, this refers to more than just code. Assets are also products and byproducts of the software development lifecycle, include software components, test suites, designs, and documentation. So how does this apply to scripting? Well, it depends, of course, but if we're going to be honest, most sysadmins will tell you that reusing scripts is challenging. And Gartner takes it even a step further, stating that reusability is possible, and I quote here, only if all the elements, like systems and software being addressed, are standard. This, however, is almost never the case, end quote. And if you've got a Gartner subscription, you can confirm this, quote, in the research paper with the Gartner ID that's currently on your screen. On the other hand, because automation is centralized and activities are pre-built for you, as previously discussed, easy reusability is a standard feature. Not only that, but in addition to pre-built reusable activities, automation also includes pre-built reusable workflow templates for automating some of the most common processes, and these too have previously been debugged, fine-tuned, and tested in real-world environments. By the way, in the case of our own automation tool, it comes with over 500 pre-built reusable activities and over 150 pre-built reusable workflows. So reusability dramatically shortens time to value. When it comes to scripting, documentation usually involves creating comment lines that start with a hashtag or a single quotation mark. And by the way, you have to consciously create those because, of course, the scripting tool doesn't document your code by itself. With automation, however, the workflows you create are themselves a form of documentation that visually explain the flow of process execution. Someone starting a new job in charge of managing these workflows can clearly see from day one what the workflows do and should have little trouble getting up to speed on learning how they work. How about coding and errors? Well, let's face it, when it comes to scripting, there's going to be errors. In fact, you're far likelier to make more errors scripting when you write code yourself. And forgive me for stating the obvious, but in order to be productive with scripts, you have to know how to write scripts. In other words, you have to know how to do programming. Some IT environments even require knowledge of multiple scripting tools. But these problems are basically non-issues when it comes to automation. First off, you don't need to know how to write scripts or do any kind of programming, as mentioned a few slides ago. You can think of automation as a collection of Lego building blocks. Each Lego block represents a pre-built activity that's been coded, debugged, streamlined, and thoroughly tested. You just drag and drop the block into place where you want it to execute. And when you assemble together a bunch of these blocks in the order you want them to run, you have a workflow. And again, there's no programming. Usually all you have to do is configure some parameters or other variables unique to that activity, and you're done. This structured process dramatically decreases the potential for errors. Speaking of coding errors, let's hear what Hewlett-Packard, one of our competitors, says about scripting, and I'll just read this out loud. Scripts for complex processes that touch multiple systems and applications are difficult to create. Scripts are also difficult to maintain, hard to share and reuse, cannot be validated for reliability prior to execution, and are not auditable. And of course, with automation, automating complex processes, maintaining them, sharing and reusing them, validating them for reliability prior to execution, and auditing them are not difficult at all. In fact, it's all very easy. Now, I mentioned a few slides ago that in order to be a true automation solution, a system needs to have lots of connections and integrations to other tools, systems, and devices so that cross-platform automation can be orchestrated from a single pane of glass. And this is an illustration of what I mean. Think about what it would take to write scripts that allowed you to streamline something like the onboarding process for new employees, a fairly common requirement among most organizations. You'd need a script to interface with an ITSM tool like ServiceNow or BMC Remedy or Jira, so you could pick up the onboarding request that's been submitted. Then you'd need a script to interface with Active Directory so you could generate an ID for the new employee. You'd probably also need a script to interface with VMware or AWS to provision a virtual machine for the new employee, and so on and so forth. With the systems needed to order a cubicle, a laptop, and a phone, or to generate SAP credentials. In fact, you'd probably need to write scripts in more than one language, adding even more complexity to the entire process. Now ask yourself this: could a junior level sysadmin do all this? Or would you need some highly skilled expert that's in short supply just to be able to even conceive such a project? Well, alternatively, with an automation solution that has all these integrations pre-built and ready to go out of the box, your junior level sysadmin could automate this complex process with ease, and he or she wouldn't need to write a single line of code to do it. That's true automation. Now, I noticed among the registrants for this webinar that there were quite a few people signed up from some of the biggest systems integrators and MSPs in the world. So to those attendees, and for all attendees who have to deal with strict SLAs, I humbly ask you to consider the following. By combining automation with the knowledge and skills of your best staff, you can leverage that talent to be far more productive and vastly more effective without having to increase headcount. In other words, automation is a force multiplier that can help you meet even the strictest SLAs much more cost effectively than you could with just scripting alone. And we're going to be diving into our live demo in just a moment. So here's some things I want you to be on the lookout for as Peter guides us through an automation solution. Being able to keep humans in the loop is a hallmark of automation tools that cater to organizations not ready to put things on autopilot just yet. In other words, building decision points into your workflow that allow you to pause execution and accept feedback from humans before proceeding. That's a critical factor. The connections and integrations I've been discussing to other tools, systems, and devices should be so easy to activate they require little more than an IP address and login credentials. Finally, a solution that enables knowledge sharing among your automation team will act as an accelerator to wider deployment. Okay, we're going to switch over to a live demo now, and while we're transitioning, we're going to do a quick poll that will show up on your screen momentarily. So please take a moment and respond to that. Also, just as a reminder, if you have any questions you'd like to ask our team, please submit them via the GoToWebinar chat panel on your screen. We'll be happy to answer all those questions following Peter's demo. And we'll keep the poll open for just a few more minutes, a few more seconds rather. Go ahead and please vote if you haven't already. Okay, and there's the results. Very interesting. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and transition now to Peter and off to the live demo.
Hello everybody, this is Peter Lee, Director of Professional Services. So one of the first steps that we're going to look at is the interactions with humans. So as you know, as you go along scripting or a more complex process, you're typically going to want to have some type of interaction with an on-call staff member or some technical person to guide the next steps in your automation or your script. How do I do that today in scripting? So scripting languages obviously have a similar type of functions that are available to you, but for me to include that, I have to determine where am I going to place it, how am I going to store it, and then also where am I going to run all of these processes from. I have a quick sample here of a PowerShell script of being able to pull back data from folders and then determine what steps I need to do next. I could call a simple email to send an email, but then how do I do phone calls if I want to do SMS, something of more higher priority? And the next step with that interaction is I'm going to want to have a response. How do I get a response back from the email? Or how do I get a response back from an SMS message? It's quite complex if I get into scripting, but how do I do that in iShare? In our platform, we have building blocks that allow you to do that. We already have out-of-box integrations with third parties, because if I want to send an SMS, a mobile app, we have integrations with Twilio, Mirror3, and Everbridge, and those are all given to you as building blocks. Now, when I get to a decision point in a workflow, where do I want to include that information? Where do I want to include that? As a developer, when I'm at my workflow designer, as I showed in the screen today, on my left-hand side, I have the list of the over 550 building blocks. So these are the specific actions that I can take in my workflow design that I simply left-click, drag into my workflow design, and release. As I build my workflow logic to make it even more simplistic, you'll see as I left-click and drag, there's little green plus signs that acknowledge the current design and allows me to decide where I want to place it, even in a conditional branch as I have here. In the small sample I have here in my workflow palette, I'm just looking to communicate, and I'm actually going to be sending a iShare IM message. And based on that message, I can then branch out to whatever response. Very simple sample. This could be saved as an individual workflow that I can execute as a child or parent. But I can also look at adding on additional workflows. So on the right-hand side of my workflow designer, we also provide templates. These are pre-built activities that are configured to be used in another simple click and drag. So for example, if I'm at a certain point and I want to leverage one of our Everbridge samples, our Mirror3 samples, or our Twilio samples, I can simply left-click, drag into my workflow, and place it at whatever decision point I want. The simple Twilio one here is for one way, but if I want to get a little more complex, I can simply use this template we have here. So if I left-click and drag, you'll see it expands onto the individual steps. So the first action is going to execute the command or the SMS message. If it's a response received, I can then look at the response that was given and determine my decision points. So this template gives me a very quick and efficient way to add at any decision point any type of interactions with an end user. That interaction is bidirectional if necessary, or based on a response, either the workflow or the system will wait for a response and then gather that information for me to be able to use downstream my workflow. So let's switch over to a more complex scenario here. So I have a little more complex or more refined workflow. In this workflow, I'm going to automate a creation of a ServiceNow ticket. It's based off of an alert I receive from a monitoring system. So one of the first steps I'm going to do is obviously create a ticket. That's done through a single action. After I get through that process, I'm looking at checking the status of the service, checking to see if the web server is up, and then at whatever point, if I want to now add in a human interaction, I can, again, simply use one of our templates that we provide, or if it's something more outside of what we have today, I can then use some of the building blocks that I have offered. So I can do a simple email, and again, just simple left-click and drag at any decision point, and release. Once I have an activity placed into my workflow designer, I simply double left-click and then configure. I don't, at any point of my design here, have to be very technical or have to be a programmer to really understand what these activities are doing. There is a help option that allows me to give more details based off of our online help system. I can also just kind of go through the wizard, entering in who's going to be contacted in this simple email, what type of message am I going to send, if I'm going to send a custom or have a pre-configured template. As I include text, I can obviously type static text. I may also use data from either a global repository or data from information that's been collected in the workflow. That data that can be collected is simply going to be used through a variable selection window. Where I can simply click on this little blue X button, and what that will bring is a selection window where I can decide where the scope of my data is coming from, either from the current workflow with a drop-down. I can access data from individual integrations. There's also a repository for global variables as well, which you can definitely do in scripts as well. But here you'll see I don't need to know the actual reference, because if I'm looking at a script, I can kind of switch back here. let's go to the more complex one here. I either have to know at the very beginning, depending on if the previous developer had included it at the beginning or at what step. I don't really know what variables or global variables have been designed. In the workflow designer, I simply go through a dropdown. If there's a new global variable or a new attribute I want to add, there's a simple little plus sign where I can create a new variable, set my usage. Is it going to be a read and write variable or read only? All through a UI. Once I place that, I can then decide what next steps will be. I would simply save it and it will be added to my repository for use for the future or use for other developers to share as well. All right, now switching over to the element for integrations. We have two separate approaches to integrations. We have quite a large breadth and growing integration packs, and then we also have a concept of connectors. And they're called connectors because if we don't have a marketed or developed integration pack today, it's very simple to start up and use iShare to connect to a non-integration pack. And I'm going to show that to you in a couple minutes. But from an integration pack, how I set that up is through the Studio client, where I simply just need to know the credentials, the endpoint, either is it a SaaS solution or an on-prem solution, then I just need to know the server information. Once I have that information, as well as I have established network connectivity between the iShare server and my third-party system, I can simply go through a wizard to set that up. So let's take a quick example for Everbridge. So if I want to connect with the SaaS solution for the Everbridge system, which is a notification system, I simply click on Configure, and then I enter in what the wizard is asking me for. Again, just need the URL, the endpoint, the username. Once I have it established, our system is now connected and communicating bidirectionally with that integration. If we look at something more of a service desk style, and we'll look at ServiceNow, for us to connect, very similarly, I take the endpoint, my credentials. Once I have established connection, our system does the full discovery for you through the integration pack, where it will discover the specific forms I have access to. But more importantly, it discovers all the fields. So for every endpoint or every third-party system that we are connected through integration pack, what we will not do is not only establish the communication bidirectionally, but we will also do a discovery for you to be able to utilize the data from the source system as simple variables. Or in this view here, I'm able to establish and build a filter where I can specify based on any attribute that's been discovered through a GUI dropdown to determine which records are discovered by iShare as actionable events. Because typically if I'm looking at automation, I'm not going to want to have every event have some type of automation process. So at this upfront view or configuration point in iShare, you can actually build out the logic that can filter out which type of events would be actionable by iShare. After discovery, and we go into a workflow design, and I'll switch over to another workflow here. With an integration pack, not only do you have that upfront configuration that allows me to monitor, set up that connection, we also provide out-of-box activities specific to that third-party system. So from a ServiceNow perspective, we give you actions to create a record, update a record, get a different record. Other systems like SCOM, for example, for learning systems, you'll see we have out-of-box activities where I, as a user, do not need to know the API layer. I don't need to know how or program the connections. So if I want to simply update a record or update alert, I simply, at whatever decision point I have in my workflow, I will left click and drag, drop that activity, and then simply configure. If we go back to the ServiceNow example, in this simple example here, I'm querying the incident, returning a specific record. Once that's run, the next part of what iShare does is it also logs every step or every action taken. So in my simple sample here, where I'm developing, I can see if I run, I'll get a result set. So my result, as I can see here, based off of the record, has multiple attributes. Each individual attribute, which is a specific column, is now accessible to you as a variable in my workflow design. So as I go downstream, as I want to interact with a human, I can pass all these details that have been aggregated at any point. I can pass that to the on-call staff member, giving them all the details without having to log into the system, without having to contact any other teams. You would have all those details in your notification up front, giving me a decision point from either a mobile device or from a phone call or from any other modality that I can now respond to and have follow-up actions. So those are kind of general focus on integration packs. Now let's say we wanted to interact with a system we don't have a integration pack today. How we set that up? You would typically have things at an API layer. As long as there is an API that is accessible remotely, our platform can be set up using standard activities, which is very important, where I don't need, again, to have a script in place. I don't need to build or program that at any layer. What iShare provides to you is multiple types of protocols, spanning from web services to SNMP to SSH sessions, all giving to you as simple single activities that I can simply, again, click and drag into my workflow design. Now let's kind of replicate from a programming language here. So if I take a quick example, and let's kind of use ServiceNow for our example, I'd have to understand all of the logic, which most programmers would, but now I have to have some place I put the script. I also have to understand what details I'm going to get back, and then make sure I parse that out correctly. What if there are changes to the form? As people grow and evolve with their systems, they usually change the schemas and add more features, but in scripting language, it's static. So I would have to go back and update my scripts, find the parts of where they are, and change that. How do I do that in iShare? So if it's an integration pack, for us to update schemas, you simply go back into the configuration module. So when I'm back in the configuration module, we have a clear cache. That full discovery that's done up front is cached all locally to the platform. So as I go through my activities and those variable dropdowns, it just does a discovery based on the cache. Now, if for any point you change the schema on the source system, our system will give you options to rediscover, to update that cache. So it's simply 2 clicks. I click to clear, and I click to rediscover. So what the system will do is go back and rediscover all the actions and attributes that I have available to me that I can now leverage into new workflow designs. All right. So now, going back to the connector standpoint. Now, if I want to use, for example, a RESTful API, how do I do that? I have a template here that I can leverage. The template will show in 3 steps that I can interact with a RESTful API and parse out to give me the data. And this sample here, I'm going to use a JSON sample. So from a specific configuration point, very similar to all other activities, I'm really just following a wizard. So for me to interact with a RESTful API, I simply need to include my endpoint, the user credentials, what type of action am I going to do? And again, we're doing a RESTful API. But if I wanted to do any other type of action, it's simply given to me as a dropdown. We are also proxy aware. So if there's necessity to externally communicate through a proxy, it's all given to you through a UI. If there's other headers that are necessary, they're simply given to you in a simple table here. Once I have that built with the 3 simple activities, I can then, if I execute this, so in 3 steps, I was able to communicate with an external RESTful API return all the data into a table that I can now access as simple variables for each one of those attributes in 3 separate actions. These actions were not custom. They were not requiring any development. They're all given to me on my left-hand panel through the web activities. So for me to create this new, I would simply left-click and drag and just configure. But one of the nice things that we offer, kind of similar to, I guess you would say, functional libraries, is that I can create my own custom templates here that could be shared across developers. So for every user accessing the system with the appropriate permissions could have access to any custom or internal processes that you build. A great feature for MSPs that have a large breadth of teams or developers on multiple different business units or areas where they can build out their own internal processes, save them as templates, where I then can use, through a simple left-click and drag, the pre-configured activities that I can utilize in my workflow design. So if I do have a workflow put in place, kind of moving to the next step of knowledge sharing. So how do I share knowledge? One of the things we just covered was the templates. So I could pre-configure steps that can be shared across the team. How I read the scripts, the difference between a script and a workflow, is very simple. You're looking at it from a top-down approach. So as I go step by step, I can read through the individual steps. What we also offer in the bottom left-hand corner is a description field. So for every step I take, I can include logic here, which is a very standard approach to the developer. If I look at a script, kind of what Guy had reference to, I have to purposely make sure I include the comments, make sure I include descriptions at every point. From the workflow designer, we give you that functionality right in the tool, where every step can be documented. We also have a feature for documentation at the workflow level. So at the workflow level, I can include full details through a rich text editor, or I can include all the details that I may need, which typical developers or scripters do at the beginning of my workflow, or your script, I mean. This can also be done here as well. But what is very nice about this is that it's going to be saved and tied to the workflow. So as I migrate workflows or share workflows, that detail is always going to be in a standard location, which is very important. Because as a scripter, I can include that comment at any point, or depending on where my best practices are for personal preferences. I can include them here, I can include them anywhere. From an iShare perspective, it's always going to be in the same location. So as someone picking this up, I can read through your workflow at a much quicker rate. I'll know because these, again, are all standard activities. I know that we have documentation at one click. I know every step includes details of what is being given at every point. Okay. Additionally, every workflow has a single repository. I can break those up into different folders, as you can see here. I have a folder for webinar with a couple of past webinars that we've done. The workflows give me the ability to export and import. So I can export them. It generates an XML file, so very simple. So I can import it from one environment to another. Also, with every action that's taken, you'll see there's a logging feature. So now, in the scripting part of it, I'd have to create either a function or library, or make sure as I go through my workflow, through my script, that I include outputs, either through a log file, a custom log file I created, or for out to the screen. Those are all functions that are required to be done manually. And iShare, every step is always documented and included in the active logs. So as I go through my active log, the same details that we saw through the tester is given to you for post review as I go through every step. So I can see here, every one of my actions is always logged that I can have access to. Another kind of cool feature with every individual active log is I can simply right-click, export to Excel. It's a great feature for support, also a great feature for internal sharing, where if I wanted to say, here's the workflow, or here's the process that ran, and here are the individual steps. It could be 100 steps that someone's asking for details about. I can simply export it as Excel, send it to them, and most people, I would say most people are very familiar with Excel as a Microsoft Office application. They can view it, because really to us, that view is actually a table. Anything that has a result is also given to you as a separate worksheet. So if I export this out, and let's go ahead and open that up here. What I will see is a very similar view, but you can see we have the result and it's a separate tab. So in my separate tab, I have all the details to be able to be shared either internally or externally. Okay. So with that, that wraps up the live demo. So I'll throw it back to you, Guy.
Peter, thank you for that excellent demonstration, and your demo generated quite a few questions that are very interesting, so let's go ahead and stay on your screen, and then we'll go right to the Q&A. The first question, and I hope I'm repeating this correctly, will automation slow down the jobs?
Slow down the jobs, I'm assuming that's referring to the execution of the processes. And in terms of that process, it really doesn't, because as you can see, as things, this is a simple process, things run in seconds. When we look at our current existing workflows for customers, workflows really don't have a very long life for them. So they're typically going to run under, a couple seconds to under a couple minutes. Again, understanding that if it requires some type of response from a human, that process is going to be external. So as a notification goes out, for example, like an email, an SMS, what we do is we have basically broken it down into two separate processes. That the initial workflow runs, sends a message, and depending on what or module or feature that I'm using, there's going to be a separate process receiving that response. So even in that response handling, it really will run under seconds. We're not looking at something that's going to run hours in any way.
Okay. Another question, what scripting languages can iShare handle or convert? Are we talking Python, C#, C++, Java?
Oh, great question. Obviously iShare's, our platform is geared towards a code-free type solution, but most existing organizations today will have scripts that they have in place, and why reinvent the wheel? So we do have a activity out of the box that allows me to use a execution. So what that means is that I can execute any action that's a current script. So through a single activity here called an executor, so let's say at this point I wanted to execute a custom script. Once I add that action, I can then point to the command. So I simply would say, where does the command reside? What arguments am I passing to it? And the only requirement there is that the prerequisites for the scripting language is either local or on the remote host that we're going to execute. Because our solution is agentless, but this particular executor can run on a local iShare server, or it can run on a remote system depending on how you scale it out. But that execution does require that I have that programming language installed. So if I want to execute a PowerShell, like Perl, or any other type of scripting language, as long as those library and repositories are on the host, we can execute it through the simple action. We do also extend on some level of programming languages that we do have C#, PowerShell scripts, and VB.NET coding activities built in today. So you could copy and paste the script using our PowerShell if you had a PowerShell script. With a single activity, I can either, again, point to the script directly or include the code here.
Okay, excellent. Next question. Does iShare have a BMC Control M interface to coordinate automation with batch scheduling?
Today, not out of the box. So again, the approaches that we have are an integration pack that we market, and that's the simple plug and play adapter that we saw with the screen here. So this is where we have all the integrations which are marketed on the website. So things that we don't have an integration pack today, and Control M1 is on our product roadmap, but for us to integrate with that, we would just need to make sure what API layer. I believe there is a web services layer for Control M, so you could leverage the out-of-box web activities to be able to interact with that. Again, it will require this when it's a connector. It will require some understanding of what the API layer looks like. So we would need to know the schema. But ideally, you would simply use a single activity to interact. So at what point I wanted to send a message or read a message through a web service API, I simply would just need to know what the details would be to include into this activity.
Okay. Next question, and I hope I'm getting this right. Is there automatic discovery of all the attributes from the devices, i.e. device info, session details, failure login, open services, etc.?
I think it really depends on what action you're executing. If you're looking at it from our integration packs, the integration packs are discovering all the attributes of the target event. So if those details that were referenced in the question are included into the, say, monitoring alert message, then yes, they would all be available at the front part of the workflow design. But if I needed to do a additional call, then yes, like a WMI, if I'm doing a WMI to a Windows device, or if I'm doing SSH, as long as you know the commands that have to be executed, all those details can be given back as a result that I could then use downstream on workflow design.
Okay. Next question. Can we use the workflow template or toolbox to create a workflow?
Yes, you can. And that's really just templates, again, just make sure templates are non-running workflows. So ideally, when I go through and look at a architecture of our platform, the templates are really used to guide and simplify development. So where I can pre-configure multiple steps, and when I use a simple left click and drag, I would simply drag and drop and include them in my workflow. You can put them in a existing workflow, or say, for example, I have a brand new workflow. Let's delete everything here. So if I was starting with a brand new workflow, you could always start from a template. Simply left click, and you'll see the little green plus sign again, release, and this will be my starting point of my new workflow that I was designing. Okay, Guy?
Okay, next question. How do you configure log storage quotas and expiration periods?
Great question. So for every module, and actually the overall feature of the system, in the configuration file, there's keys that allow you to define those options here. So let me see if I can bring one up on the screen here to kind of show you here. So there's a archiving utility built into the system at the active log level, and if I can bring that up here. Let's see here. So at the archiving level, you'll see here we have keys within the config file that you can define. The interval of how often we're going to archive, the number of days that we keep before we permit delete, and the number of days before we archive the data from the transaction table to a stored table, to an archive table. Additionally, with every component within iShare, there's also a debugging level. So say, for example, I'm going to be looking at logging the individual processes from a single component. Very similarly, there's also log levels here. So I can specify the level of debug level, and then also the number of days to preserve for the individual log file that's generated as well externally to the system.
The questions are coming in fast and furious. Next one, is there an HP Quality Center connector?
Not today that I know of, but I can definitely take that back to product management and see if there's any other background to that. So if we'll collect that. What I would recommend is to always submit these types of requests through our support portal. So support.ayahoo.com is a great place to ask these similar type of questions, and then we can review them and see if we have a connector available today, where we can give you kind of some sample templates to begin with. A good example is one we just finished with Heat, the SaaS solution. So for Heat, it's not one of our integration packs, it's one of our connectors. So what we would deploy and provide in that scenario is a list of activities or workflows that allow you to connect to it. So one of the examples I showed on the screen here today is our kind of similar template for creating the authentication key. So for Heat, which is a non-integration pack, so it's using our standard activities, I'm using a simple post to allow me to interact with their endpoint web service.
Okay. Next question. I think the question is meant to be phrased, how is time-based log and report deletion process done?
So I believe that's kind of similar to the archiving question. So I would assume what we're looking for is being able to control the number of logs, because again, we do capture every step, every point in the logs. So when I look at the logs for every event that comes in, we do record it. But to control and make sure the backend database is not overloaded, there's the archiving features that allow me to define that.
Okay, this one is a two-part question. Can log data be accessed via reporting tools, i.e. Power BI? And the second part, can custom database tables be created within the tool and specific logging data sent there?
So they're very similar, but I'll take the first one first. So today you could, but you could also export that data to your BI repository, for example, and you include that in your workflow logic. So as long as you have the database information, you can actually build that into the workflow. So in a workflow, we have out-of-box activities through a database connection. So if you look in our repository, you can communicate with DB2, MySQL, Oracle, and T-SQL commands. So as long as you know the connection string and what type of schema you're going to be inserting into, you can simply just use a single statement at the endpoint of your workflow and insert the data that you want to insert into that external repository. Storing in a custom table local is very similar to the BI system. So you could add to the schema multiple tables and custom. Though just a caution there that you would have to make sure to maintain that, because for upgrades and everything else that may go through our life cycle of the platform, there may be changes to the schema and everything else. So just something to have to consider as you keep those custom tables. There's no impact to the application itself to add custom tables to the database that's created through the installer, but just something you have to consider for maintenance going forward. And very similarly, you would just insert those records or the data that you need into using one of these database activities.
Okay, next question. What if I need granular control of the process? For example, I may need to parse a log file for a keyword and then transform and put it into a message. Can these things be achieved?
They definitely can. So in the steps of every workflow activity that you take, every step generates output. So if I'm going to read a log file, so if it's a simple log through like Windows, for example, I'm going to read that file using one of our file and folders activities. Or if I'm going to do an SSH session and be able to just do a grep on that file, that data is always going to be given to you as output. That output then can be added at any point, especially with a notification, to simply through the variable selection. So at the focus or the local, which is workflow, what you would select is the particular activity step that was taken, and that would include the reference using our reserved character of the percent sign to reference that output. Because what you will see is as I pick every activity has a unique name. So for every step you see that you build in your workflow, it does require that you specify a unique key.
Okay, are the activities customizable? Can we create our own? How?
today in the current platform, that's not a function that's available, but I will mention that our next generation release, which is going to be, it's actually in beta now, and hopefully will be in GA very soon. And that platform is going to give us the precursor to provide an SDK to end users, and I think it's a big one for MSPs, to allow them to create their own individual activities, where you'll be able to leverage those in your toolbox here. But in the interim, what you can do is simply build out the steps you want and save those as a workflow, and you could always call that workflow through a standard action here. So you'll see there's an activity called one workflow. So if I have that child process that I'm going to always call, which could have all the steps I need for my function that I'm going to be using, I can simply reference it. I can either have the workflow wait for that child process to run by leaving this unchecked, or if it's a parallel process that has to execute that I don't need to wait for output from, I can simply click on run in the background, which would run it in parallel to my current process.
Okay, we've got too many questions and not enough time, so we're going to try and answer just one or two more, and then we're going to have to send out answers to the rest via the follow-up email. This question, for a process such as a new hire, what triggers automation? Do staff start in an application such as ServiceNow, which then triggers iShare to execute a workflow to populate other systems, Active Directory, etc.?
I think it really depends on what systems you have today and what your current process that you have leverage. You typically, from our experience, would have some type of ITSM service desk tool generating or creating the request up front. Otherwise, we also do offer a self-service portal that I can log into. So we do offer a customizable website that basically is a front end to a workflow that would allow me to have a end user access the web portal through a browser session, and include the inputs would essentially be passed to the web to the iShare server for processing, and then I can use any of our AD activities to manage that account as necessary.
Okay, let's do one last question, and then we're just going to close it up. So, if approvals are required, human intervention, to execute a task, how is that set? And if no response is received, will it halt forever, or can it be set up to follow like a 3-strike rule?
Great question. So there's a couple of things you can do there. Every activity that you have within iShare does have timeouts. So for things that do external actions, so if I look at the ability to do an advanced communicate, which allows me to go through multiple tiers, you'll see I'll have a specified time to wait for that particular person to respond to. So in that time frame of it, we'll only wait for that time. What you would also, as a best recommendation from workflow design, and it's kind of a requirement in our workflow designer, is that as I do a conditional type action, so if I'm basing it off of the output or the response received in that time period, there's a feature called default branch. And what that particular type of error handling type check does is say that if none of the other conditions are true, it will always go down this branch. So in your design, again, from a best practice standpoint, you're always going to have one type of default or the error type that says if nothing is, if a person didn't respond, for example, or if it's an unknown response option they chose, for example, that particular branch or this particular custom process would be what would be executed in those type of scenarios. But our system, again, would always want to have some type of timeout, because we're not going to have this active for days or months, because again, it just takes a process on your host.
Okay, there are many more questions, fantastic questions you guys submitted, but we're running out of time and we don't want to go over. So we're going to go ahead and just display one more slide for you all, and we're going to kind of summarize and talk about next steps. So we'll just wait for that to come up on your screen. Peter, thank you very much for those excellent answers. Okay, so as a next step, we strongly encourage you to visit our website and learn more about how you can use automation in your environment and speed things up maybe from what you're currently doing with scripting. IAHU provides a free 30-day trial copy of iShare that you can download and evaluate yourself with all the features that you saw demonstrated today. If you need any technical assistance while you're testing it out, we provide that assistance free of charge during your evaluation period. And that concludes today's webinar, everybody. Thank you all very much for attending. Have a great rest of the day, and we'll keep up this screen for a couple more minutes in case you need my contact information to get in touch. Thank you very much.